Okay, good evening everyone, and welcome to this meeting of the South East Midlands branch of the Institution of Agricultural Engineers. It's great to see so many of you. I think we're approaching 50 now, and delighted to see that Eugen Kramer from Switzerland has joined us. I don't know if there's anybody else from around the world, but it's really nice to have an international audience on this occasion. Anyway, you've all come to hear, not me, but Dick Neal. And just to introduce Dick, he's technical manager at Hutchinson's crop protection. Hope that's still the case, Dick.
Yeah. Yes, it is.
I've mostly seen a hole somewhere, and I wonder if you're competing with Selwyn Richardson, are you, Dick, in being in holes in fields a lot of your time?
Something like that, yeah.
Yes, yeah. I see, and looking at your profile, that we've actually shared some past. Like at Wood College, to be precise, where I see you took an HND in agricultural engineering.
Yes.
I took the same thing about 10 years before you, so yeah. Something common in our past. But I read a lot about Dick because he's widely reported in the farming press on a wide range of soil and machinery related issues. And yeah, I was interested to note his recommendation that traditional farmers should actually take some messages from the organic farming sector. And that's was something I sort of been very tuned into, having had a visit in Netherlands to organic farmers there. And they really have they've got to play by their wits, because reach into the cupboard for a chemical to deal with things. So they've really got to think about how they grow things. And I think there's a lot of synergy, or needs to be a lot of synergy between the growers and conventional growers. So I think we're in for a treat this evening with Dick's presentation. He's steeped in the practicalities of soils and how they can be restored and sustained, and we look forward, Dick, to your presentation. So I'll hand over to you.
Okay, thanks, Tim. I'll just share my screen.
If anybody's having trouble with reception, probably best to mute your or to turn off your video.
Okay, can you all see that?
Yeah, I can. I'm assuming that I can speak for the rest. If I can see it, I presume everybody else can, Dick.
Okay, that's good. Righty-ho. I can just get my pointer up for later as well.
Oh, sorry, Dick, can I just interrupt you what you said earlier? If anybody has got questions, please do use the chat to raise your questions. And Dick says he's very happy to take those as he goes through his talk, because otherwise a lot pile up at the end. So do ask questions as Dick goes through, and I will ask them appropriately as he goes through his presentation. Sorry, back to you, Dick.
Thank you, Tim. Okay, lovely to be talking to a group of agricultural engineers. As Tim said, that's my background. I trained as an engineer many moons ago now. I've been a farm manager, I've run trials, and I've been with Hutchinson's both as an advisor and technical manager for 25 years this year. Well, 25 years last year, actually. I'm now in my 26th year. So I've been at it for quite some time, and I've seen it really from all sides, both repairing machinery and selling machinery. So, you know, I've been on all sides of the coin. I've been on the dark side, as I would term it, certainly as a farmer. And I'd like to think I've now seen the light in the error of our ways. I was asked to talk about healthy soils and what parameters we should really look at in measuring what is a healthy soil. Well, you'll straight away see on my title there, I've really put a line through healthy. You know, as a business, we already run something called a healthy soils assessment. It's already branded, and that's not going to get changed. But actually, as I go through my understanding of soil, and you learn every day when you're dealing with soil, I tend to work on this notion of functionality now than I do healthy, because actually what might be described as a healthy soil for growing one crop may not be regarded as a healthy situation for growing another crop, if a crop requires a different range of pH, for instance. So I very much work on functionality of the soil rather than quote whether it's healthy or not. So soil functionality is about producing good crops, and that's both cash crops and cover crops. I mention both of those because I spend quite a lot of my time visiting farms where I am shown absolutely fantastic cover crops. Everybody grows fantastic cover crops and extremely proud of it. I remember not too long ago, actually, farmers seemed to be quite proud of the amount of blackgrass that they could grow. But covers, certainly, I'm shown covers all the time. However, I might go back 3 or 4 months later and I'm thinking, God, your cash crops look absolutely awful. Usually because the wrong cover has been grown in the wrong place at the wrong time for the wrong purpose, and it's left the soil in the wrong state to get a cash crop in successfully, or there's allelopathy going on between the cover crop into the new cash crop, or the cover crop has sucked so much nutrition out of the soil, there's nothing left in doing the establishment phase for the cash crop. So, you know, I'm looking for that soil to produce good crops, whether they're cash or covers, and not just one type. I want that soil to infiltrate water throughout the year, not just in the winter, but in the summer too. I want that soil to maintain, store, and release that water throughout the profile. A lot of attention is paid to drainage, quite rightly, in heavier soils. But I think, again, we've taken that too far, where we are now looking, certainly in the UK, we have this obsession of getting water, certainly in the winter, through the soil profile and out to the drains as fast as we can. That is considered to be good drainage. And it's not, of course, it's bypass drainage. It's not the way soil functions. Soil manages water in a completely different way. And we really need to focus on storing that water, managing it throughout the profile in the right way, as nature intended. And having that water available to the following crop in the summer months when it's dry, so that crop always has access to water being released from a truly functional soil. I wanted to cycle and store good nutrition and have that nutrition in a plant available form. I want it to be resilient to both wet and dry periods, so that we can get crops drilled and those crops will survive during the drought periods, which, and I'm sure you've all noticed, we tend to be going to blocks of weather now. It's either very wet or very dry. And looking at some of the forecasts, we could be in for at least a month of dry weather now, which would be very reminiscent of the last 2 springs. So we need water availability for those crops to traverse these extreme weather events. It needs to be supportive and resilient to traffic, because we are farming the soil. We are running increasingly bigger equipment, whether it's combine harvesters, tractors, or drills, etc. They do weigh a considerable amount, and we need that soil to be supportive and resilient to that traffic passing across it. And then we also want the soil to store and cycle carbon. Storage is not something we should aim at in isolation. As farmers, what we're doing is moving carbon from one source to another source. Everything's made up of carbon. There's a finite amount of carbon within the world. It's just where we're putting that carbon at any particular point in time. And as farmers, we are taking carbon from the soil and selling it off as the crop. So again, the thought process that whatever we do using cover crops, FYMs, compost, etc., is just loading carbon into the soil. The better we make the soil function, the better crops we can grow, and actually the more carbon we can move off. So we need to be measuring how our carbon's flowing quite closely. I think the thing that focuses most growers' minds, certainly of all the growers that I talk to, it's mostly about water management, and particularly in the last 2 winters have really focused the mind. And 2012 is in a lot of growers' minds as well. It's not very far or long since we were in that year. So there's a real memory and fear of excessively wet soils during the autumn and winter months. What you've got to do, and what I always encourage growers to do, is have a look at where their water is. Why is water being held up in a particular place? Why is their drainage not functioning as they would expect it to? Are they looking at surface water, which is ponding? From my point of view, this is an increasing problem right across the UK. I see more ponding as an issue than I do bad drainage most of the time. Surface ponding, of course, is caused by the inability of the water to infiltrate through the soil surface, down through the lower horizons to get to the drainage drains in the first place. So surface ponding for me is usually a sign that it's got nothing to do with lower drainage. It's usually to do with how we've managed the soil surface. Is the water in the upper horizon? This usually occurs where we may have smeared the soil lower through either putting in a plough pan or a subsoiling pan, or we've compacted the upper layer of soil with heavy machinery in a damp time, and we've got water held up in the upper horizon. The lower horizon, if that's full of water, that's usually starting to indicate that actually the exit point, the drains, the ditches are starting to fail. The water's passaging down through the soil, but it can't get out. So wherever that water is in the horizon, it starts to offer us pointers of where the problem might be occurring, rather than it is always the drains and the ditches that are the problem. Throughout the profile, well, if it's excessively wet throughout the profile, again, that's just one step on through the lower horizon. That usually shows that the drains have packed up, or there was no drainage there in the first place, or the whole soil horizon has been compacted, as many of them have been after growing root crops in the last couple of winters, for instance, harvesting operations. So once a grower tells me where he thinks his problem is, I always ask, well, have you checked? Because the number of farmers that don't own a spade still shocks me. Although I have to go and look for one. Luckily, I've always got one in the back of my truck. Usually, I've always got one in my hand. It's my constant companion these days. And checking where the problem is and why that problem is there is of real importance. Soils are saturated, in speech marks, and a headline that leads to many assumptions. And certainly, I had to have a conversation with a number of journalists who rang me up about saturated soils this autumn, and I said, well, they're not saturated. We've got surface ponding, and if you stick a spade in, they're dry underneath because the water can't get through the surface and down into the soil. So soils are not saturated, far from it. They're not managing soil properly, but let's get our terminology right so that we're taking farmers in the right direction. So always investigate and understand the issues that are occurring in your soils is what I say to every grower, rather than assume that what they've read in the Farmers Weekly is what's happening on their farm. So we have had some really wet areas, and again, the farming press will talk about these. They love bad news, absolutely love bad news. I've been with Hutchinson for 25 years. I do a lot within the press, and I know only too well that they get very excited about bad news. They love a headline. So if we've got a particularly wet area of the country, it's like the whole country's wet. And in 2019, the fact was that Lincolnshire and through the Midlands area, Leicestershire, Nottinghamshire, across to Wales, Shropshire were particularly wet. And you look at the Met Office weather map at the bottom, you can see that year actually started in June. We had 7 inches of rain in a week in the first week of June, that particular year. But also the figures I've got up there are just showing you that it's not the first time it's happened. We've had these situations in the year 2000 or 1993. So we've been there and through these. And of course, if you talk to any grower from Lincolnshire in autumn 2020, then they got drilled up absolutely fine. So they went from drilling almost nothing in autumn 19 to getting everything drilled up in really good conditions in autumn 2020 with few problems at all. However, if you were farming in East Anglia, that's a very different kettle of fish. That heavy rain moved south in 2020 to settle over East Anglia. And again, you can see at the bottom, I've got October 2020, November 2020, and December 2020. And it just shows where the rain was focused in October. We then went through quite a dry period in November and back to more rain in December, and it carried on again in February. So again, we have an excessively wet area of the country, but the whole country is not wet by any means. And we've got a much wider level of cropping than we had in 2019. I've said it's really important to understand where that moisture is within the soil. And within our Helix farms, we're using soil probes every 10 centimeters down through the soil profiles to measure what the water is doing. And this is a Northants-based farm, so it's a clay base. It's been direct drilled for a number of years. It uses a John Deere 750A, so it is not moving very much soil at all during the drilling operation. When it gets wet, because it's Northamptonshire clay and because it's a disc-only drill, we can suffer with getting crops established in a very wet autumn. But I wanted to use this graph just to show that you can see how the soil is drying as the crops are growing through the latter part of the summer. So June and then August and then into September. Certainly June and the 5th of August is where we've got those crops that are being grown, sucking water out of that soil profile. So you can see that the orange dot there, which is the upper zone, the 10 centimeter measurement of soil moisture, is really very dry, getting drier by the week. Subsequent depths are drying in unison, but actually when we get down to 60 centimeters in the soil, we're only varying moisture content down there by about 5%, depending on what crop and how deep the roots get in the soil to extract that moisture. When it started to rain in September, you can see that actually, because it's direct drilled, because it's a clay base, so it self-structures really well, it cracks evenly because it's direct drilled, so we don't get these big fall down cracks that we've been used to. It cracks evenly, but the water is being managed through the profile in a very organized way, and the whole profile is wetting up in the correct way, not in layers. The water's moving down through the profile and wetting up very evenly. So you can see that we were at a very close bunching on the 28th of October there and in 30th September, because it rained a lot on this particular year's 19 in September there. You can see we've got a very close bunching of the soil zones in terms of their wetness. But if you look across to the left, you can see that we're talking about 25% moisture. So these soils are far from being wet but they're evenly moist throughout the profile. And that's exactly what we're looking for. We have to employ the correct remedial action. And then we've got far too many farmers who regard the subsoiler as the only remedial action whenever they see water. So here we have clearly got surface ponding. Growers gone in there with a subsoiler to try and relieve that surface ponding. It hasn't worked. I know this field extremely well. I pass it almost every other day. It changed hands recently, and the grower that bought it, knowing that it sat with water quite some time, and it's recently had an under drainage system installed in this field, which in the first year worked perfectly well. But it grows all sorts of crops: courgettes, onions, sugar beet, potatoes. So it gets abused a little bit and worked really hard. It's a glorious grade 1 Wisbeach silt. And that field at this point in time that we're looking at photograph has been subsoiled 5 times in 18 months because the grower is utterly convinced that he's got a drainage problem. Well, it only took me, and I was walking the dog at this point, and I got my, and I didn't have a spade with me. I didn't need it. I could just lift out some of the soil from one of those subsoiling legs, and we can clearly see where the problem is. It's overworked surfaces, overworked seedbed. The soil is structureless. There's no aggregates there. It's running together really tight, and the water can't passage through it. We look at this area here, we can see that that soil actually, there's some rooting in there, there's cracks and fissures, there's aggregates actually in that area. But fundamentally, it is not wet. It's really quite dry, and it just crumbles in the hand. Well, that's a classic situation of where that field will be described as at saturation, and it's far from saturated. It's just that top 1.5 inches that is extremely wet due to the inability of that water to infiltrate the surface. A subsoiler is not going to fix that, and we could do it very cheaply with a light surface cultivation. We need to monitor and observe and embrace natural processes. So everybody's looking for this magical measurement of what's good in my soil. What metric do I use to show people that I'm making real progress? And there isn't any one metric that you can use. I always tell people to monitor what's going on their own farm and what their soil is doing. Really observe the way their soil reacts, the way their crops react to what they do, and what happens after a natural process has occurred, whether it's frost, whether it's rain, whether it's high temperatures. Look at how your soil is reacting to that. So I've got 2 trays of soil here, and this is typically what I use for one of our healthy soils assessments. You can see one is looking very hard, very blocky, would be described as compact by most growers. And then the other tray is a nicely aggregated soil, open structure. It's nice and crumbly all the way down through the calcareous clay subsoil as well. Now, I'd remind you of what we were looking at in that water management measurement that we were carrying out at the Helix farm, where the crop is drying during those summer months. As the crop grows and extracts water from that soil is drying, and it's drying quite rapidly in the upper zone. What happens when you remove that water, particularly in a clay-based soil, is that the clay dries out, it goes hard, becomes extremely resilient to carrying weight. You try and stick a spade in there. Everybody inspects their soil immediately after harvest to make a decision around cultivation. That is the wrong time to do it, because you're trying to stick a spade into very dry, very hard soil, particularly if it's clay-based. So growers then naturally make the assumption that that soil is compacted. It looks compacted, it feels compacted. those holes that I've dug, or those trays of soil that I've dug there, are in the same field and they're about a metre apart. And all I've done on that tray on the right-hand side is I've added water. I've let it soak in for about 24 hours, and then I've taken the soil assessments from the dry soil and from the moist soil. And you can clearly see the difference in that soil structure just by adding moisture. So I always encourage growers to take a soil assessment around now. Perhaps not this year, we'll wait another few weeks, but in April, when we're coming out of the winter, the soil's just starting to dry, the crops are really getting their roots down and starting to grow. That's when I like to do a soil structural inspection. If that soil is in good structural condition right now, the only thing that is going to change between now and harvest is that that crop is going to suck all the moisture out of that soil, converting it from a nicely structured, porous soil into this block of hard clay. But if you add water, it goes straight back to how it was. So instead of running around with lots of high horsepower and burning diesel and wearing metal away, just wait, be patient, let it moisten back up, and then get in there with the appropriate cultivator. So what we're looking for in our soil structure is good aggregation. We're looking for organic matter throughout the soil. We won't get it throughout the soil profile, but we can get it to a fair depth, certainly in terms of rooting. Biology tends to function in about the top 8 to 12 inches of the soil, and it declines quite rapidly as we go to depth. But the biological function is really key for building these aggregates that I'll explain in a minute. Building those aggregates are porous, so they suck in water, manage water correctly, store water for the summer. And you can see on that aggregate, well, that's a PED on the left-hand side. You can see that there are a group of aggregates there stuck together. They're all different sizes, and they are all interspersed with organic matter, roots, old organic matter, residue from previous crops, whatever it might be, but it's all the way through that piece of soil. And you can see holes and crevices all the way through it as well. On the right-hand side, that's a pretty heavy calcareous clay. You can see I've stuck some blue dye with water down through there, and then I can see where that water has traversed through the profile. That water takes about 10 minutes to get from the top in a dry soil, from the top down to about 1 metre depth. So it travels really quite quickly, and hopefully you can see how that moisture, the intense blue areas, that's where the intense blue areas show you where you're getting most water rushing to. As the blue declines in its intenseness, that shows you where the movement of water is slowing, and the soil naturally filters out the blue dye, and it gets paler and paler and paler. But you can see that's very much associated with worm burrows as to where that water has gathered at depth most quickly. So if we get in a little bit closer to those soils, you can really start to see the aggregates forming here and the cracks and fissures that are present within that soil. And that takes on this chocolate cake structure that people like to describe it as. But that's very much what it is. But to a lot of growers, their perception is that soil is tight and needs breaking up. They want to take their spade and it goes into the soil with minimum resistance to about 12 inches deep, full depth of the spade. If they can do that, soil's loose, the structure's good, and everything's tickety-boo. Actually, you should have to put a reasonable bit of force onto your spade to push that spade into the soil. Should be even resistance all the way down, but you should be able to, or should need to put a reasonable amount of force on the spade to dig through a good natural structure. We blow up on that calcareous clay soil. Again, this is at the dry end of the season. The crop has extracted moisture out. If that soil is compacted, which would be the assumption of many growers digging into that soil at that time of year, how come that is absolutely full of fine root filaments, root hairs, root structures, all the way through that soil? If that soil is compacted, those roots won't be there. Not like that, not in that proliferation. But clearly that soil is not compact. And if I blow up a little bit closer on that lower horizon of that particular soil, you can see, as I was saying, how the passage of water down through that soil and the passage of deep working roots in that soil is associated with those wormholes. And those wormholes are anesic wormholes. So it's also important to understand and be able to identify what type of worms you've got in your soil. Because you may have a soil absolutely full of endogenic worms, but they are not going to provide you with that drainage to depth, that root access to depth that you get from the permanent burrows formed by anesic worms. And ironically, anesic worms need feeding on the surface. They come up and build their middens on the surface and feed that way. They don't like their food being buried down in the soil. The endogenic worms tend to utilize the residue that the anesic worms have brought down into the upper part of the soil horizon. So they very much work together. You'll have all seen this. This has been talked about many times. We're well used to measuring as growers the chemical makeup of our soil. The physical side has always been talked about: structure, root penetration and function, aeration of the soil. And as an engineer, you'll all know plenty of machines get sold on the basis of aerating the soil and restructuring the soil. We may get lots of oxygen into the soil by using cultivations, but cultivations certainly don't restructure. They may remove problems identified within the soil, like a subsoiler can remove a pan if set correctly, but the subsoiler is not restructuring the soil. It is removing an impediment to that structure, but it's not restructuring. The only way you get restructuring is through natural processes, and that's where the biological circle comes in. Cycling of nutrients, disease suppression, the aggregation of soil, the soil life. And all of those three things are linked together by soil organic matter. If you have to pick any one thing that you want to focus on to improve your soil, the metric that probably matters most, it's soil organic matter. However, there is soil organic matter, and soil organic matter. And there's far too much emphasis placed on loss on ignition or dew mass measurement of soil, which is really picking up that fresh residue in the middle there, which also tends to make up the majority of residue that we see day to day in our soils. So returning crop residue very much depends on its carbon to nitrogen ratio as to how functional and useful it is in the soil. It's always useful. It's always having a beneficial impact, but the impact may not be what the grower thinks he's getting or expecting. So cereal straw in the UK, wheat straw, oat straw, barley straw, is one of the highest carbon to nitrogen ratio products that is farmed on a regular basis on the planet. So as an industry, we have a real issue with cereal straw and getting it to decompose back into the cycle within our soil and release the nutrition that is within it. However, if you've got a heavy clay soil and you plough lots of cereal straw in, it stays as cereal straw for quite some time. What that does is it opens up the soil. It keeps it apart physically, keeps the clay platelets apart, breaks up the soil structure, and it is very, very useful for improving soil structure. And it is a base on which soil biology can start to build aggregation. But in terms of the cash crop that we're going to put in, particularly if it's something like a second wheat, cereal straw can be a real pain in the backside. And it's one of those, if it's a second wheat situation, I certainly advise most growers, that's the time to bale your straw off. Cut your stubble a bit higher, leave some in the field, but get the rest of that straw off. Because actually with a carbon to nitrogen ratio of 100 to 1, or up to 100 to 1, that is an extremely hungry residue. And the biology needs a lot of nitrogen to break that straw down. Biology feeds first because it's most mobile, so your crop suffers. So there are a time to keep straw residue, and there's a time maybe to think about moving it on because it's more hassle than it's worth. Winter oilseed rape straw, so if there's anybody who's direct drilling, they'll probably know that they can very successfully drill behind winter oilseed rape. They can very successfully drill behind peas and beans, but drilled almost on the same day, drilling into a cereal straw is a completely different kettle of fish. And that's partly down to this carbon nitrogen ratio, but it's also down to the root structure that is left in that soil and the way that soil behaves going through the drill. So peas and beans and wheat and oilseed rape straw, you can see, are a much lower carbon to nitrogen ratio than cereal straw. So it degrades and gives back what's in the straw very much quicker than the cereal straw does. But also because of the root architecture, winter oilseed rape, peas and beans leave the soil in a much more, and certainly the upper part of the soil, in a much more open, friable condition than cereal or grass roots do. So if you're direct drilling, the soil behind oilseed rape and peas and beans will flow through the drill, shatter open, break down into smaller aggregates and give the drill something to close the slot with all the time with very easily. Whereas with cereal straw, and particularly if the soil is a bit dry, that drill has got to tear that root mass apart. And the drill just doesn't have time to shut that resistance back down again. And we end up with an open slot and really poor crop establishment. Slugs go straight down the slots, etc., etc., etc. And then there's digestates and biomasses. And again, the grower should have these things analysed so they understand what the nutrient content is, the likely cycling of that, but also its carbon to nitrogen ratio. Because what you can do is take a very high carbon nitrogen ratio like cereal straw and add it to something like sewage sludge or chicken manure, something of a very low carbon nitrogen ratio, and the two balance each other out. But only using one or the other can create a bit of a seesaw effect in your soil.
Dick, there's a question here that might be pertinent to this moment. Caroline Knox is asking, is there any research on liquid digestate and worm mortality? And is there an ideal weather soil condition to minimize mortality? Is that something you know about?
There is. It's not so much worm mortality. It depends on the soil condition at the time that it's being applied. It very much depends on the cubic meterage being applied, and it very much depends where the worms are at the time it's being applied. It also depends whether it's pure liquid digestate or whether it's a mixture of solids and liquid. If it's pure liquid and there's a lot going on and it can run down the wormholes, I've already shown you how those wormholes will transfer liquid down through that soil really quite quickly. And that can flood those holes. It's just come out of a anaerobic condition. It can be quite sour, and the worms really don't like it very much. Having said that, often people report that they've put digestate on, and when things get measured in a trial, they put digestate on, then they dig a hole and try and find worms, and they dig a hole against an area that they haven't put digestate on. I know from experience doing healthy soils inspections in fields, when you've got active populations of anisic worms that have those permanent burrows, those burrows can go to 2 meters deep. Well, I've seen worms go from the soil surface to 1 meter deep in about 30 seconds. They are that quick going down those holes. They fit exactly. They can stretch themselves out and pile down those holes at a phenomenal rate of knots. When you're trying to catch them and dig them out, you just can't keep up with them. So if you pile a load of product on like digester that they don't like, it's not that you actually kill the worm, it's the worm just goes, I don't want to be here, I'm going to go 2 feet, 4 feet down. Then when you dig a hole to check where the worms are, you can't find any worms. Oh, the digestate has killed the worms. Worms are very fast moving. So I'm not convinced it kills worms. It will do if you drop worms into it. I mean, they don't like that. But in the natural process of things, I think worms are far smarter than hanging around in a soup, chemical soup they don't want to be in. They'll leg it out of the way. Endogenic worms, it's slightly different, is they don't have permanent burrows, so they're much, much slower at moving through the soil. So if a lot of digestate is infiltrated into the soil where endogenic worms are present, that could be a problem. But again, in the summer months, when the soil has dried up near the surface where we're running our spreaders on, all the worms have gone to a greater depth because it's too dry for them upstairs. So they've tended to go to a greater depth. Or they've gone into diapause where they curl up in little balls. That's not helpful if you then soak the soil with digestate. But I've never seen a soil that's been soaked, put 30 cube of digestate on. The soil is far from soaked. The top couple of inches might be wet, but that's about it.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, somebody's mentioned a RAP published research showing how digestate reduced earthworm numbers, and there's a web link, so it's something people can look at. And also somebody else has asked, have you heard about the hypothesis stating that high CN ratio plant residues promote biological nitrogen fixation in soil? In other words, using low quality plant residues could help capture atmospheric N. This idea is promoted in some French conservation agriculture networks. It's been shown that biological N fixation occurs during wood decomposition, which may have helped spread this theory. I guess that's asking for.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can go round and round in circles if I'm honest. I mean, I personally just prefer to work with good basic research and sensible observation and thinking in the field rather than get too hung up on lots of possibles and theoreticals around what may, I mean, you know, there's recent research that shows that trees produce methane. So we've been through the cows, all the cows have got to go because they produce methane. So, well, if trees produce methane, which they do, they can measure that they produce methane, then on that same argument, then all the trees have got to go. You know, we can keep going round and round in circles and beating ourselves up with all this stuff. High carbon to nitrogen ratio crop residue is good to have in your soil for good long-term soil structural processes, water storage, etc., etc. But it's not going to cycle a lot of nitrogen for you. It's going to do quite the opposite.
Right.
So it depends what you're wanting the organic matter to do for you. If you only ever put straw residue back, your soil is always going to be fighting a battle of utilizing nitrogen to break that straw down and utilizing nitrogen to feed the next growing crop. So we have to create a balance within the soil. I mean, equally on light sand soils, I've got lots of growers who get lots of turkey and chicken muck from farms in Norfolk. They throw it all over their sand soils and it makes their sand soils more productive. However, after about 5 years of doing that, the soils are just screaming, I can't cope anymore. It's running down the hill, down the road. Why? Because that turkey muck and that chicken muck is feeding the crop and they're harvesting better yields, but it's very fast burn. There is no soil structural relationship with that material, and the structure degrades, and every time it rains, the soil's running off the slope and down the road. There's a balance to be struck about what we want our soils to do and how we farm them. So that's why I've put in there in that green box in the middle, soil protection and structural stability. They're anesic worm food. They're biology then focused on decomposition, which burns carbon. So you are losing carbon as well from the soil when you're putting just those things there. If we look over to the left-hand side, to the light green box, then that's where we've got living organisms. And let's not forget living organisms being measured as organic matter. So as their bodies, as they die and their bodies decompose, they are organic matter within the soil. And there's increasing research that they are an even bigger part of the organic matter makeup of our soil than anybody ever thought. The thing is with them, they are very rapid cycling. They give nutrition back very, very quickly. They're very low carbon to N ratio, could be 8 to 12 to 1. They are aggregate builders. So we require them in the soil in good numbers to build those aggregates. They have a rhizosphere interaction. So they are functioning right around the root system of a growing plant all the time. And then they need that growing plant to function properly. And the microbial biomass is the highest contributor to organic matter, way above crop residue that we can put back. But it's not being focused in that way. And that makes up about 5% of the organic matter. That's not 5% in the soil. We have about 4% organic matter in soil, most of our soils. And of that 4%, about 5% of that is living organisms. 10% is fresh residue. And then the blue box, which can also make up about 10%, is the cycling fraction of organic matter, the active carbon in your soil. This is the bit of organic matter that is actively cycling nutrients. It's becoming the building block for the microbial activity to build soil aggregates around. It's the piece of the organic matter that is best at storing water. It's the organic matter in the soil that can have an active or show an active improvement in your cation exchange capacity of the soil, which not all organic matter does do, but at this stage it can improve the cation exchange capacity. It's endogenic worm food. So these worms are traveling through the soil in the top 12 to 18 or 8 to 12 inches. They are looking for this partly degraded residue that they can function on and degrade further, and that's feeding endogenic worms. But it's very rapid burn in dry soil, so you can lose it very, very quickly. But 75% of the organic matter we have in our soil is what we would call stable humus, and I hear lots of people talk about adding humus to soil. Well, if you're adding humus, you're adding organic matter that has already been around for many thousands of years, things like soft coal, which you're adding into the soil, but you're not really adding functional organic matter like you are in those 3 boxes on the left-hand side. You're adding a very stable humate product that has just about got to the end of the line in terms of delivering nutrients to that soil. And that's shown in the next slide. But the other thing not to forget is plant roots. Keeping plant roots actively growing in the soil all the time put liquid organic matter down into the soil, and they are 2 to 13 times more important than crop residue at building organic matter within our soil. You can see how old this chart is, and it's looking, this is from the American prairies and looking at cultivation over a 100-year period. And that 75% of humic organic matter that I'm talking about is that passive organic matter pure pool at the bottom. And you can see that however we're farming that soil above it, that passive organic matter really doesn't change very much. It's very, very stable. It neither gives nor takes. It's very, very stable within the soil profile. But plant residue, the active organic carbon, the slow organic carbon, and the total soil organic matter decline very rapidly when cultivation starts, and only really starts to recover when cultivations are stopped and vegetation is allowed to re-establish on that ground.
Yeah. Can I just just a couple of other things here, perhaps before we move too far away from this. Somebody's asking, is there any research to say that farmyard manure should be buried in the soil for improvement in soil humus structure and the increase in decomposition rather than spread on the top?
No, if you want to degrade it more quickly, you spread it on the top. You engage with your worm population. So the worms, the FYM will build worm population, that brings them in, and the worm population will clear it and take it down through the profile in a much more organized fashion than trying to cultivate it in. I know the powers that be will have us always having to cultivate manures in. I use a straw rake a lot to cultivate manures in. It's a cultivation, but it leaves it exactly where I want it for most benefit in the soil, rather than trying to incorporate it. And incorporating it actually slows down the decomposition process.
Thank you.
So moving on, the soil food web. This gets talked about quite a lot. Got, a couple of years ago, it was being thrown around in every presentation you had. And it's extremely important. And it involves, as you can see, a whole plethora of things going on in the soil. It's a real battleground. So you've got bacteria, you've got fungi, you've got nematodes, you've got protozoa, amoeba, you've got then the things that are recognized like mites and spiders and millipedes, and then the worms. And then you've got the higher level, trophic level, which is your moles and the mice, etc., beetles, which are basically all of what you see on that page is eating each other constantly, and that is giving us a constant cycle of nutrient within the soil, and also building aggregation within the soil. The important thing to recognize about the soil food web is that it's made up of a number of trophic levels. We have to think about each of these trophic levels to make sure that we're getting the whole functionality within the soil. And when you have it functioning properly, what you then start to get is better mass flow of water and nutrients in the soil. You get better diffusion. You get better absorption, desorption, immobilization, remobilization of nutrients. You will also get better infiltration of water because we're building better aggregation, which is giving us stability in the soil and allowing water to passage through properly. It's reducing the bulk density of the soil, which is allowing it to work easier. It's improving the porosity of the soil, which is allowing water to be stored within that soil much more effectively. It's going on 24/7. So whereas getting a cultivator out is a one-pass job done situation, then it's all over. This is going on 24/7, and it's going on 365 days a year. It slows down in the winter months as the temperature drops. It speeds up at this time of year as the temperature starts to climb and the soils are full of roots and there's moisture there. It declines again a little bit as the soils dry and the temperatures rise in the summer. But fundamentally, this is going on 24/7. And it's absolutely vital that this is working properly in order to have soil that is fully functional. And I'll remind you, it has the greatest impact on building soil organic carbon.
There's a comment here, Dick, that the problem with soil organisms is that a lot of them don't pass through a 2mm sieve and therefore are not accounted for by loss on ignition analysis. Is that a
Oh, no, they're not. I mean, you know, loss and ignition is a pretty crude metric, if I'm honest. I mean, if you've got a chalk soil, you send a load of carbonate into the lab, and they stick it into a kiln at 900 degrees C, they are going to burn a lot of that carbonate off. So you'll regularly get chalk soils that come back from the lab at 40, 50% clay content when you've got it in your hand and you're going, there's no way this is 40 to 50% clay content. And this is where it comes down to having someone in the field who understands the basics of soil mechanics, texturing, etc. Because some of the information you'll get back from the lab can be extremely misleading, simply because the lab's not infallible. Like I say, if it burns off carbonate, it can send you back a figure. It's texturalized through a laser. Everybody does a laser texturing. Why? Because it's the best value for money. The best way of doing a soil texturing is to do a settlement test, but it's too expensive. Nobody wants to pay for that. So we go for a compromise, and the compromise is the figures can come out wrong. As long as you understand why those figures might be wrong, and you're also standing in the field saying they're not right, and I understand why there's a difference, then that's fine. But lab results are not infallible. Supporting healthy soil biota and microbiology is really, really important. So the first thing is just don't kill it. So disruptive cultivations really do disrupt soil biology. High loading soil fungicides, you know, on the one hand, if you're talking about trying to build the level of fungal activity within your soil, but at the same time, you're applying high doses of Amistar to try and control take-all, or high doses of Amistar in potato bulbs to control potato skin diseases, well, don't be surprised if you are killing a whole plethora of fungi in your soil that you didn't want to kill. Same with nematicides. We're all focused on controlling PCN in potatoes, free-living nematode in sugar beet, etc. But only about 15% of the nematode population in your soil is a root feeder. But nematicides will not discriminate. They'll just take the whole plethora of them out, and then you leave yourself a big gap. If we are feeding PCN more frequently with a potato crop, guess which species of nematode is going to proliferate? So at some point, we need to stand back and start thinking about the natural processes and how we're disrupting them, not giving themselves chance to rebuild within the soils. And bare soil is an absolute no-no. Bare soil is dead soil. It cannot function without growing root within it. So bare soil is an absolute no-no. Feed it with organic matter. It needs something to process. That's short burn and long burn, like the cereal straw. It needs nitrogen to feed on to power the processing of that carbon. But that nitrogen ideally should be cycled nitrogen from natural processes, legumes, fixing nitrogen in the soil, etc. Not just bunging on another 20 kilos of N from the bag. That can cause as much harm as it does benefit. Growing crops, obviously that avoids bare soil, and growing crops are really important, as I've indicated, and surface residues, because surface residues, whether they're fast or slow burning, protect the soil surface for a period of time from heavy weathering, sunlight, heat, etc., and protect the aggregate so we get good water infiltration. And then protect it The surface residue, again, is a food source for much of it. Reduce traffic weight to improve soil, keep the soil in good structure and good porosity. Diversity of crops. That's difficult to find, the diversity of crops that make money, but that's where we can use things like cover crops to add lots of diversity. So if you're a predominantly cereal grower, personally, I see absolutely no point in growing oats as a cover crop. You grow cereals, grow something different when you grow your cover crops so that you're adding diversity to your rotation. Cultivate sympathetically. I'm not an evangelist where I would say, oh, it's direct drilling and direct drilling only. That is a tool in the box that we can use. I do use still quite a bit of cultivation, but that cultivation is very sympathetic to the soil needs that I've got in front of me. And think about the cause and effect. Is what you're seeing caused by what you did to that soil last time? Is it caused by the weather, or is the fact that it's chucking it with rain in your soil ponding? Is it the rain that's caused the problem, or is it the way you manage the soil that's caused the problem? Be prepared to change thinking. Lots of studies now on the impact of cultivation. This is from a potato research side of the AHDB. And I'm going to highlight the shallow ploughing, which is to 9 inches. And you can see against all of the other deeper cultivations that have gone on, we've got depth of soil along the x-axis and soil. Yeah.
Sorry, I think there's somebody coughing in the background.
Okay. We've got soil resistance over on the left-hand side, and you can see that there is least soil resistance under that plough, the shallow plough, compared to where the soil has actually been moved to a greater depth than that, indicating that every time you move soil, you put it in a more recompactable state than leaving the soil alone in the first place if there wasn't a fault with it. So you can see here where the first levels of compaction, what would be regarded as compaction, are being detected under each of those cultivation systems. And with shallow ploughing, you detect compaction deeper in the soil than you do with any of the deep movement cultivations, because we've broken up the soil to depth and it's recompacted at a faster rate. Cultivations do not restructure soil, they break it up. Work I was involved with the AHDB and cover cropping trials. This happens to be one of my farms, and you can see, look where we've got 1 megapascal of resistance all the way down through that soil profile, where we've only cultivated 2 inches deep for 6 years. And we've got 2 cover crop mixtures, and the blue is no cover crop in there. And we don't get to go towards a figure of 2, which would be resistant to roots penetrating much further, until we're 35 centimeters down in the soil. In this side, where an 8-inch cultivation is being carried out every single year, be it a direct drill, a strip till drill, or a time cultivator or a plough, where we've been moving soil to 8 centimeters deep every single year, so 20 centimeters, 8 inches, you can see that where we've moved, the base of where we've moved that soil is as tight as hell. I'm looking at a figure of 1 here, all the way down to 30 centimeters. We're starting at 1. By the time we get to 8 inches down, we're at a megapascal resistance of 3. So cultivations do not restructure soil. They do not make soil work easier. Again, change the way you think about it. So formulation of aggregates requires the organic matter to build around, and it requires the microbiology to stick the soil particles around that organic matter and build and build and build the aggregates, until we get from 0.003 millimeters to 3 millimeters. And we want a variable range of aggregate sizes throughout our soil. And these aggregates are being built and dying or crumbling away over the period of about 4 weeks. You know, they're constantly being built and crumbling, built and crumbling. And what is building those together is that soil microbiology. And this one I've called them the glue factory. So it's all their puke and pee and poo and the decaying bodies that are producing sticky substances that are locking that soil together around that organic matter and building aggregates. And then you've got things like the fungi, hyphae, also releasing glues that are building aggregates further in the soil. Worms as well, passing soil through their bodies, building aggregates as they come out of the other end, and particularly the endogenic worms building aggregates really quickly within the upper part of the soil. And here we've got a classic picture where this grower is using this old set of discs here. He's got to this point in the field before he's got rained off and he's had to stop. Well, look what's going on where he hasn't pulled those discs through compared to where he had pulled those discs through. Saturated, sat in water, and that is not ponding where he hasn't put that additional cultivation through. Even where we've got a fairly rough seedbed here, we can see the level to which that soil is degrading as the rain falls upon it. And we're seeing this everywhere now. It starts as small issues like this. It's capping, there's no aggregates, we're getting little bits of ponding going on here. That ponding grows and grows into larger ponds. And a couple of years later, we've got crop failure right across the field. And you can see how that soil is just separating out as silt and sand in this case. And it's, it's really something that just can't go on. I use this quite a lot live in the field. And this is a pot test where I stick the soil in the water in the top. On the right-hand side there, you've got soil that's been heavily cultivated all the time. On the left-hand side, you've got soil that's being sympathetically cultivated. And you can see in the pot on the right-hand side, and the picture of the top of the pot, it's covered in this scum of bubbles. That's all your CO2 and your microbiology being let away from that soil as it degrades and all falls to the bottom of the pot, because it just cannot handle the way that water is rushing in and wetting up that soil. No glues in there sticking it together, and it just falls apart. And that's effectively what causes our capping. And we see this sometimes as an opportunity. So this is one of our field demonstrations that we were doing. A really wet November. We had about 2.5 inches of rain during this demonstration in one morning. And I dug these trays out of a chalk-based soil with no cover crop, a single species cover crop and a multi-species cover crop in it. By the time it had finished raining and I went to empty these trays out on my way home, this is what it presented to me. So on the left, wrong button. On the left, I've got no cover crop, and you can see that there's no water sat in that tray because that soil has sucked in all of the rainfall and just turned to porridge. The single species cover, you can see a little bit of water sat in the tray, and hopefully at the top here, you can see a difference in color. You can see a darker area here where the roots are. Single species cover, so only one root architecture, and then it goes quite gray again down here, and a little bit of water through, and this is quite wet. Come over to this side, multi-species cover, root architecture all the way through that soil profile. You can see it's the same color as this bit at the top here, but a completely different color to this. And the tray is full of water. Why? Because that soil has managed that water. It's taken in water in a controlled way. It's wetting up in a controlled fashion. It hasn't turned to porridge, and it's allowed the excess water to passage through and go to drainage. And that water is clear. It is not washing the silt and sand out of this soil and washing it down through the drains as you would get with this kind of soil. Once it's reached that stage, the next piece of rain is just going to wash that straight down the drain or down the road. So again, that is an observation. of what's going on in front of us. I didn't lay that out to show that, it's just the way it ended up. It's just another indication of the jar test, showing what happens when you're using low soil disturbance, high crop diversity, cover crops, and in this case, livestock, to how your water stays clear compared to the suspended soil particles where you've got high disturbance, low diversity, no cover crop, no livestock. So we offer a healthy soils assessment that takes all of these things into account and does a report for a grower, point him in the right direction. And one of the clear indicators is worms. This was from our Brampton site when we were running the blackgrass trials there. And you can see 5 years of surface tillage compared to deep tillage fundamentally changed the population and speciation of worms that we had in the soil. Work from Jackie Stroud showing that roots, 30 to 40% of roots are found in biopores at a soil depth above 60 centimetres. Anything below 60 centimetres, the only way you'll get roots passing down through that soil is through biopores. Biopores is a nice way of saying, a scientific way of saying wormholes. So without worms, you won't get fundamentally deep rooting in our soil. Important to understand what worms we want. I've mentioned anisic and endogeic. We rarely get epigeic worms in arable fields. They tend to be a forestry or under a hedgerow where you've got lots of surface litter. But anisic and endogeic are the two worms we have in our soils. Most soils will contain a decent number of endogeic worms because they'll actually put up with being turned over by a cultivator. But anisic worms, if they get hit by a cultivator or their burrows get broken up, you can really decimate their population. And they need food on the surface, not buried down in the soil. So shallow tillage, and you can see just to the left of that last pass how deep we're actually working there. Shallow tillage really important. Good consolidation behind that tillage is important. Lots of machines on farm can be adapted to work shallowly. So this was designed as quite a deep working cultivator, but by stripping metal off it, changing the point type, we're only working that at 2 inches there, and that grower is extremely happy with that piece of kit. That particular piece of kit is made by a number of manufacturers who've just painted a different colour. But these types of things can all be used. Here's a machine I was involved with, designed with cousins, and that's there putting in cover crops. So we can adapt these machines with seeders. When they're only working to 2 inches deep, we can use them to put in the cover crop, which then stabilises the soil, gives us something to drill in on the green, or at least keep that living crop in the soil growing on all the time. And presenting the right soil to our drills, particularly where we're using a direct drill, is vitally important. So I can imagine Mr. Purdy is smiling at this point because he's seen this slide before. This happens to be a John Deere 750A drill. Traveling at 10 kilometers an hour, you are moving at 2.7 meters per second in a straight line. The length of that drill kit there is about 830 millimeters. So it takes 0.3 of a second to travel 2.7 meters at 10 kilometers an hour. That means the drilling element of that drill, the bit that's got to cut through the residue, open the slot and place the seed, has got 5/100ths of a second to do it. The closing slot wheel on that drill, which is an even smaller patch area, has got 2/100ths of a second to close that slot. So you can see why, if you do not present the right seedbed to a direct drill, it ain't going to work. It just doesn't have time to sort itself out. You've got to present that drill with the right friability of soil for that drill to work right. Not picking out John Deere here, any drill of that type, it's the same situation. Get it right, and there is absolutely nothing wrong with the result that you can achieve. But get it wrong, and it's pretty much no crop at all, and wet soil. And this is the farmer that I'm working with. He's employed us under our Healthy Soils analysis to help him through the transition process. He's bought himself a strip till drill. He's on sand-based soil in North Norfolk. This is post sugar beet. He decided that part of the field was probably too wet and he was going to get his plough out. So we are ploughed and combination drilled on the left here. We are strip till drilled on the right here, and that is the resulting 2 crop stands within there. So I walked this field with this grower and he said, well, it just shows me that I have absolutely made the right decision in the way that I am taking my soil management, because that's what I always used to get. And this is what I'm getting all the way across my farm now. Close up on those, you can see the soil is starting to run and ribble and move where the plough has been employed. A sand-based soil, so it has no structural integrity of its own. Over here, we're using organic matter, not a lot behind sugar beet, but we're using organic matter in the surface to maintain building worms in its soil as well. Now, I'm told you can't get them in sand, but you can. But also, I point out, look at the tram line in here. Look at the depth of that tram line and the impact that that has on the crop, and his ability to travel to feed that crop whenever he needs to, rather than waiting for ground to dry. And I'm going to wrap up with a quick look at soil biology properties. So lots of work gone on. This is largely through RAP, looking at farm manures, compost, paper crumble, and crop residue as inputs, and then measuring their benefit over time and the impacts of certain elements within the soil. So we look at biomass nitrogen. You can see that they pretty much all have a benefit. They're all above the line. Potential mineralized nitrogen, they all have a benefit. They're all above the line. Fungal development within the soil, they nearly all have a benefit. They're not all quite above the line there, but they largely have a benefit. Available water capacity, they clearly all have a benefit there. Porosity, the same in the soil. Bulk density, we are looking for a lower bulk density, and they pretty much all have that as a delivery. And penetration resistance, so reducing compactability within the soil, they tend to have a good impact there. But of all of those things, what is the one thing that stands out to you as having the most benefit? Well, it's the blue lines. So it's FYM. So if you really want to start improving your soils rapidly, apart from growing crops wherever you can, including livestock within your farming process, really does have a disproportionate benefit on the performance and functionality of your soil. So, in thinking very differently about how we manage our soils, then we should optimize low-risk cash crops in the rotation. Cereals are very robust and low risk for most growers. Legumes and oilseed rapes should form part of the rotation, but increasingly only 5 to 6 years inclusion because of flea beetle, etc. with rape. Gaps should be filled by intercrop and overwinter cover crop or things like winter linseed. Not a lot of it, but a bit, the odd field here and there. All of those things might be best described as rotational primers or suppressors. You can switch things off or switch things off by picking the right crops to do different things. They can prime biology and nutrient cycling. They help suppress pest and disease by providing a healthier soil for the crop to grow in, a more functional soil. And they are cultivating the soil, structuring and managing water via root interaction all the time. So, having a growing crop, really, really important, whether it's cash or cover. And from a cover crop point of view, I would always use a multi-species cover so that I've got maximum root architecture. And within that species mix, I'm just focusing the ratio of the different plants to give me exactly what I need from the the crop in that particular soil situation. So I've banged on for quite long enough. I'm going to wrap it up there. So is there any further questions? More than happy to answer. Or you can shut it down when you like, Tim, as we've overrun time a bit anyway.
Okay, thanks, Dick. Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. So I was talking to myself for a while there. Yeah.
Schoolboy error.
It's just not a further question, but a comment, is to share another unconventional theory. The man who defined earthworm types, anesic, epigeic, and endogenic, Marcel Boucher, took samples of soil from earthworm burrows and has shown it was packed with N-fixing bacteria and was very nutrient dense as compared to the rest of the soil. Beyond their physical roles, earthworms may also be very good contributors to nutrient cycling and crop nutrition. Is that something that you would endorse, Dick?
Oh yeah, I mean, we could talk about worms all night long. Yeah, worms generally, the lining of their holes, the worm cast that they produce, I think generally have, and I've got to remember all the figures, but about 5 times more nitrogen, 7 times more P, 11 times more K in an available form to plants. So worms are really, really important for that. And also the deep working worms, the anesic worms, if you dig down into your soils and follow the trail of anesic worm burrows, what you'll see all the way down is you've always got a biological level of soil on the top, which is a nice dark brown, and then your subsoil tends to change colour, usually much lighter greys, greens, mottled colours, and you will always find as the burrows go down a deposit of nice dark brown soil that the worm has taken in its stomach from the top of the soil and has deposited lower down. By the same token, that worm is filling its gut with soil from 1.5 meters, 2 meters down within the soil, bringing that back to the surface and depositing it in the biologically active zone. So deep working anesic worms are bringing nitrogen, P, K, trace elements that are otherwise unavailable in a non-biological active zone down, really deep down in the soil, brings those to the surface and deposits them in the biologically active zone so that your soil microbiology then can work on that to make all of that NPK and trace element available to the growing plant. And people can cite scientific papers from all over the place. What we know is that everything works together in the soil. So plants are reliant on microbiology for their function. Microbiology is reliant on plant roots for their function. The two things work together. They cannot be separated. If you separate them, you get a poor result, whether that's in a cover crop, soil structure, or yield of your cash crop. So we've got to bring all of these things together in a more balanced way, rather than, says the man who's sold chemicals for 25 years, rather than go, I have a weed, here's a herbicide, that will kill that weed. We have to ask the question of, why do I have that weed? Where is that weed coming from? Why am I giving that weed the chance to infect my crop? Just like we've learned about blackgrass. Blackgrass was filling a gap that we were giving it. We were throwing the doors open, drilling monocrops, just wheat, just oilseed rape, drilling everything in August and September, and then giving ourselves only a herbicide to control that grassweed. Herbicides to which that grassweed developed rapid resistance. The only way around that was to understand when that weed grew, how that weed grew, from what depth that weed grew, and how we could apply cultural controls to stop it happening. And as an industry, we're hugely successful at doing that. And we can do that for our soils as well, with just a bit of focus on how we should achieve it.
Yeah. Matthew Izard has got a question on that, on cover crop species. What would you suggest to help soils recover from the last 2 wet winters? Is there a particular range of species that would do that particularly well?
It depends on the soil type that you've got. If it's a wet soil, then you need to incorporate quite a few water pumps, as I call them. That would be the brassicas, the radishes, brown mustard, white mustard. But you also need, while you've got brassicas sucking water up from the depth, you also need a set of plants in the upper part of the soil that are going to transpire that water off really quite quickly. So that's where you need things like the linseed, the buckwheat, the phacelia, that are producing a really fine root system up in the upper part of the soil to stabilize the soil and utilize that moisture and transpire it off as fast as possible. Because if the only thing you do is put radish and mustard in, don't be surprised when you put the drill in there that you've got quite a wet soil, because those plants have pumped water from lower in the soil and brought it up to the top. So you need to have a well thought out mixture so that you've got roots all the way through the depth of the soil, and roots that are having multiple impacts all at the same time. So you're getting away from this monocropping problem of wheat roots only do one thing, or oilseed rape roots only do one thing. You want to take the opportunity to get a range of roots doing multiple things in the soil. So if I take our maxi cover crop that we've got on here, linseed produces a really small needle-like root that shoots down through the soil and produces then quite nice fine side branching, but it can get itself to some real depth, and is a great soil stabilizing little plant and is relatively cheap. Buckwheat solubilizes phosphate within the soil. It produces particular acids that solubilize phosphate within the soil, making phosphate that is locked up in the soil available to growing plants. That can be the neighboring cover crop plants around it, so that it's not leached or moved off from the soil. It's not likely to be leached, but it could be washed off, or blown off. But it keeps it in a plant available form. You've got Daikon radish, which are punching down through that soil and opening the structure up for other roots to follow, and is pumping water. What it's also doing is it's sucking in nitrogen, storing that nitrogen in that tuberous root, which then rots away quite readily and gives that nitrogen back quite quickly. Fodder radish, you've got a slightly different depth of tuber and a finer root system than you have with the Daikon radish. Brown mustard, you've got a low-growing, quite adventitious, low-growing plant, quite adventitious root system. It's very winter tolerant, but low biomass, making it much easier to drill through. Hairy vetch, very reliable, fixing nitrogen, obviously. Phacelia, just a brilliant little plant, big plant, actually. Cotton-like wool root system, builds aggregates in the soil like nothing else you've ever seen, but builds quite fine aggregates, whereas your radishes are building quite big aggregates around their root systems. And you want this mixture of aggregates to get good water movement and storage. And crimson clover as well in this particular mix, again, a nitrogen fixer. Crimson clover, so it establishes really well, will grow for a couple of years if you let it, but that's about all. So doesn't cause us too many problems, but a good nitrogen fixer, low growing, easy biomass to deal with. But as a package, you've got everything going on in there that you want in the soil in a nice in this cover mix in here in particular, in a nice even mix of percentages. If we look at our maxi rooter mix, it's exactly the same list of crops, except we've changed the ratio. So in maxi rooter, we've got more of the radish and the mustard, because they're the things that really punch down through the soil and open up things like compacted headlands. We use Maxi Rooter a lot on turning headlands, just to get that ground open, because it does get a bit tighter over time. There's just no avoiding it. You're always turning on those headlands.
Okay, thanks, Dick. Another question from Athanasius Mandis. Hope I pronounced that reasonably well. He's asking, given the benefits and the practices described in this presentation, is there any reason the government is not more prescriptive in actions required by farmers to improve soil health? There is no soil strategy as part of the Agricultural Act and ELM schemes, just a series of pilot projects between 2021 and 2024. Have you any comment on that, Dick? Is that something you're involved with?
The comment I would make at the moment is that certainly from a DEFRA point of view, there are a whole bunch of new faces in DEFRA. They took a lot of criticism from us and from growers about the dogmatic approach that has been taken in the past. So, we had things like the EFA requirements where you had to pick cover crops from a specific set of choices. They were pretty much all rubbish. Like I said, they were given the choice of growing oats or rye as the cereal basis for an EFA cover. Most growers wanted to put it into spring barley. The last thing you do in front of spring barley is grow a cover crop predominantly of rye or oats, because your yield will drop in the spring barley. It's just allelopathic. Also, it's taking nutrients out of the soil. It just doesn't like it. So, they were just bad choices of cover crop for growers to utilise, but you had to utilise them because that was, if you wanted an EFA payment, that's what you had to do. The new staff at DEFRA are at the moment paying an awful lot of attention to what growers are telling them about the options that they need and the flexibility they need within those options to achieve the right outcomes. And I would have to say at the moment, certainly on the outside looking in, those new staff at DEFRA are very, very open to listening to what growers want and need, rather than them setting the rules to tell growers what thou shall do. So whilst there's lots of pilot schemes going on, I think the deadline was today for most of the pilot schemes. Actually, if you wanted to join them, I'm hopeful that the schemes will develop into some very helpful systems for growers to utilise within their business.
Yeah, one thing from me actually, Dick, that I sort of typed up right at the beginning of your talk was your description of soil functionality immediately made me think, well, that's actually what a non-traffic soil gives you naturally. That's what it has, including the firmness that you describe over time. I've looked at soils that have been controlled traffic for 5 years, and they're not soft. They're actually quite firm, but very structurally stable. And
absolutely. And by definition, really, if a grower is going to CTF, then he's already putting into practice a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about. Because if he doesn't, the CTF won't work.
No.
So if you go to a 12-metre CTF system, you are not going to pull a cultivator at 8-9 inches deep. You're just not 12 metres wide.
No, and you wouldn't want to.
You're already going to a very sympathetic cultivation system, a very gentle drilling system. You're tending to leave all your residue in place because you don't want balers running up and down fields, etc., etc. So you're already a long way down the line of all the things that I'm talking about. For smaller growers, where the investment in a wider CCF system is not viable for them, I take them in another route, which is just go very, very light. So big tyres, low pressures, as light tractor as they can run, moving minimal amounts of soil. So, the tractors they're running are 8 to 10 ton units. They're not 25, 30 ton units.
Problem is, though, of course, you in August, which is traditionally one of our highest rainfall months, and it's not a month when crops are taking moisture out of the soil. You're putting in your combine harvester, which is the heaviest vehicle of the lot. So if you do nothing else, you put your harvesting system on controlled traffic, perhaps.
Absolutely, and that's where, yeah, I just say, growers, look, be sensible. Look at the issues that are causing you the most hassle, which is your combine, which are your grain trailers. Make sure your drivers are disciplined. That combine only goes around the field on tram lines when it's not cutting crop. And the trailers in and out of the field do not go out of tram lines except when they are unloading. And they never turn around in the field loaded. They're always facing to come out down a tram line on the loading and the fill run. Yeah.
Anybody got any other questions? You're welcome to unmute yourselves if you've got questions to ask. So do please come out of the out of the woodwork, as it were. Anybody got anything else to raise?
Hi, I'm a bit new to some of this. It's Marion here. I was just wondering about what you were saying about the worms that you don't see, the epigenetic ones.
Yeah.
That you don't get those in arable soils. I've got some paperwork from AHDB that said that epigenetic soils worms do occur, but just in the surface. So I was like, when I was sort of doing some counting, worm counts, I was sort of including those as well when I was doing them. Am I way far of the mark doing that, or should I just be looking for juveniles and adults?
I would suggest you have in your mind, in an arable soil, you are just looking for anisic and endogeic, both adults and juveniles. The endogeic come in many species, so they're all colours of the rainbow, really. When you get them in your hand, they tend to curl up in a little ball in your hand, whereas if it's an anisic worm, even if whether it's an adult or a juvenile, the moment you put them in the hand, they stretch out and they're looking for an exit. So you can sort of quite readily tell the difference between the two types. I've yet to see anything in arable fields that I would definitely say that is an epigeic worm. And actually, Marion, I don't think it matters. I think it's a level of detail that doesn't really matter. Whether they're epigeic or endogeic, they're up in the top working with organic matter near the surface and creating soil aggregation. The anisic worms have their own burrows. They go down to 2 meters deep and they are creating your drainage passages and access for deep penetrating roots to get rapidly down into the bottom of the soil. Actually, the absolute detail of whether I've got epigeic or endogeic doesn't really matter in my view.
Okay, so if it come out of something like a 2-year herbal lay, I'm still not going to see. There's still going to be endogeic.
You might have, in that kind of situation, you might be finding epigeic worms working in the residue right on the surface. Yes, you might well be.
Okay, thank you. Because what I was looking at was sort of 10 centimeters, sort of a square block of 10 centimeters approximately, or 15 centimeters that I was sort of digging a hole. So yeah. I didn't. It's quite a tight. Well, it's a heavy clay. So in Northamptonshire, so it's quite a heavy clay. So it's not. I'm not getting. I haven't really seen many anisic worms. So
well, I think what you've also got to do, it depends on the time of year that you're digging. They do like the soil quite wet, so actually to assess numbers, it's probably best to do it in January and February when the soil is really quite wet. The other thing is, and I mentioned it earlier, and actually I was going to respond to the question or the response that said that RAP showed that where you put on digestate, worm numbers declined. And I would go back to my answer of, look, anisic worms will move at a phenomenal rate. down through their burrows. So if you pour something into the upper part of the soil they don't like, they will just go to depth and get out of it. So you then stick a spade in to dig those worms out. They're not there to measure. And likewise, if you stick a spade into your soil and start to wriggle that spade around to try and get that soil out, and the worm, an anestic worm, is just in front of your spade blade, it will sense that soil movement and leg it downwards. It won't wait there to be dug out. So what you've got to do is look for the surface signs of worms as well. So anestic worms will build middens on the soil surface. If you've got 30 middens per square metre on your soil surface, you've got 30 anestic worms per square metre in your soil.
Yeah, yeah.
Right, got you. I was quite interesting because what happened to the soil was it's on a slope. It's heavy clay on a slope, and what's happened is the guy put FYM on and didn't manage to get on again to move it. And the last time, so I was the first one on before the spring drilling. So that was the last time he got on it, was to spread FYM that didn't manage to get incorporated. Yeah. I managed to get on because he just didn't have the equipment to do it with. I went on to do the soil tests, and for the worms, the volume of worms underneath the straw matter was ridiculous. I was struggling. I had the wrong size, like a Petri dish with a lid. I had the wrong size of those to actually capture the number of worms I was finding. They were legging it. They were so fast. I know what you mean. It was like trying to catch them was crazy. But thank you very much for your advice and your talk. Thank you.
You're welcome.
If I may add a comment, I recently did an investigation in the earthworm population, depending on traffic and tillage practices. And I found that the epigeic group was quite abundant, and it is suggested by many other papers that indeed the reduction of traffic of tillage depth increases the number, and this is what of the epigeic earthworm group, and this is what I also found. So it's not that they are not present. Probably when we deal with deep tillage, they might not be so commonly observed, because under deep tillage, they were over 2.5 times less abundant than on the zero tillage. So this might have been the previous conclusion. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with that. I don't disagree. I'm talking as a general, because actually when you look at the UK situation, if you're looking at direct drilling, it's still only about 3 to 5% of farmers who are actually just direct drilling. 95% of farmers are still moving a significant amount of soil. So, we don't see epigeic worms in most of those situations.
Yeah.
But I agree, it's the same with just about everything I've seen in soil, and I'm sure David Purdy would agree with me, I saw him on. If you give it the chance to come, it will come. They're there. You've just got to give, whether it's the microbiology, whether it's the worm population, if you give it the opportunity to survive and thrive, it will.
Yeah. Dick, any other questions before we start to wrap up? Because I'm conscious of the time. Anybody else got any burning questions or comments?
Can I just ask one quick question, please?
Yeah, David. Yeah.
Fascinating talk, Dick. You partly answered my question by mentioning the work you've been doing with cousins, but how many machinery manufacturers have you or others worked with, or are they just really wanting to sell lumps of steel rather than design systems that are of benefit?
No, I'm involved with, I got involved with cousins originally from the blackgrass because that was the early days of shallow tillage, if you like, for a real purpose. I went round a number of UK manufacturers. I thought I'd go for the UK guys first. I was shown the door with the vast majority of them until I gave John Cousins a ring, and he was willing to engage. And we've had some real success with a range of kit that they've made. But recently we've been working really quite closely with Amazon. Simon's been really helpful. Slightly different kettle of fish to Cousins. I can go in and suggest we do something, and John Cousins hands me the bit or the modification 24 hours later and goes, "Is this what you mean?" With Amazon, I can't get anything made unless the guys at the factory can make 50 of them. So a little bit slower, but we've made some real good progress with Amazon. And we actually do quite a bit of training for their staff in soils as well. So we do a bit of a reciprocal thing. So their guys understand where we're coming from. And we also work quite closely with Jeff Clayton. We actually do the agronomy on Jeff's farm. And Jeff was a real skeptic over cover crops. And hopefully in the last year, I've convinced him otherwise. So yeah, we're doing quite a bit of cover crop work with Jeff and helping Jeff and his team develop their drill to be lower, move less soil and be useful within the cover crops situation as well. So now we're working with quite a few manufacturers now.
Thank you.
Good question. Okay, Tim, can I ask?
Yeah, Ken. Yeah, go ahead,
Yeah,
Ken.
sorry, apologies in advance. This is not a very specialist question, but a lot of our group here in the north of Scotland, non-farmers, non-agriculturalists, have watched the Netflix movie Kiss the Ground. And I watched through this, and it's a long time since I was an agricultural engineer. And I could see no science in it. It sounded like a great Hollywood movie, but nothing behind it. Is there anything that I can pass on to friends and neighbours that, you know, supports the whole idea of the tillage that you're suggesting, rather than, you know, do this and it'll work?
There is a huge amount of science in the background that supports what we are talking about in terms of the functionality of soil, this interaction between microbiology and roots and microbiology. There is a huge amount of science on that, and a huge amount of science that is developing all the time. It's just that people never really looked at it. You know, the fact was that, you know, 10 years ago, I started looking. I'd been moving soil in a more shallow way because I found it helped me control blackgrass. That was, as an agronomist, my driver was shallow tillage helps me control blackgrass. And actually, I don't see any detriment in the way my soil behaves. So I thought it was a good thing. I didn't really have a clue as to what impact I was having in the soil. It was just that I was getting better control of blackgrass. As an agronomist, that was my driver. You know, as a farmer, I had ploughed every square inch every year. That is what I did. That's what everybody did. It was only when I started to really look and try and understand how blackgrass functioned, and that was based on hard science from Rothamsted and ADAS and other areas, where it was telling us blackgrass only wanted to germinate from 50 millimeters deep in the soil. It only wanted to grow during the months of October and November and had a resurgence in April. There were lots of things that it did. Well, if we used all that information against it, so we could either bury it and leave it there, or we could make it grow by tilling it in the position that it wanted to grow from, and we delayed our drilling to pass the peak of emergence in the autumn, and we made sure that we were putting another dose of residual on in February just before the March emergence in the spring, we could beat it. And as an industry, we've adopted that approach, and we've done a fantastic job on blackgrass compared to where we were 10 years ago. It was based on bits and pieces of science that we brought together as one group of scientific approaches, and it worked really, really well. There are lots of little snippets of scientific information about the way the soil functions, what worms do, how plants talk to each other, how nutrients flow in the soil. And if you bring it all together, it does all work. The effect is massive. I'm well aware I've got areas in the country like Cornwall, like Scotland, like the northwest, sorry, who are absolutely wedded to the plough. Yeah, I've got growers in all of those areas who have moved away from it and are being extremely successful. But you have to apply it in the right way. If you only decide one morning that you can get a 40% grant on a John Deere 750A and you stop ploughing, which you've done forever and a day, and go direct drilling with a 750A or a weaving GD or any other fine disc drill like that, you are going to fail because your soil's not ready for that. You're changing your soil's diet. You're asking it to do a completely different thing. You're giving it massive indigestion, and you're not establishing your crop into a nice friable soil because you haven't created a nice friable soil. So you've got to move from A to B in a logical set of steps, understanding all the bear traps that you can see along the way. And if you do that right, then you can transition any way you like. And growers will always say to me, oh, yeah, well, that's okay. You're showing me how to do it here, but you won't be able to do that on my soil type. And I always say, well, your soil is made up of sand, silt and clay, the same as everybody else's. You may have a different ratio of clay, and it may take a bit longer for us to do it, but we can do it. We can do it on any soil. The approach might be different. The cover crop choices might be different, but we can do it.
Dick, on that very positive note, which is great to hear, I think perhaps we should bring it to a close. But you've provided us with an enormous amount of information, and I would encourage people to look back over this presentation, really to be able to take it all in, because there is just so much there. But yeah, thankfully we are recording it, and yeah, we will be able to, anybody can dip into it as a member of the institution, and hopefully, you know, there may be a few people out there who think about becoming members of the institution as a result of a whole series of talks that we've had now, both lunchtime talks and technical talks in the evening, that of great value from some superb speakers. Dick, I'd like to just read down some of the votes of thanks had. So Declan Flynn, really interesting talk. Thank you very much. Just moving down again beyond that. Cheers, Dick. Really interesting answer to his question. That was Matthew Izard. Athanasios, well done. That was to me, sorry. I'm trying to pronounce his name. You've got that reasonably right. Thomas Fugenzi, beautiful presentation. Thank you very much. Thanks, Dick. Really useful insights from that's from Anathiasias. No, I got it wrong then. Didn't trip off my tongue then. So, sorry, Athias. Mike Whiting, a varied and interesting session. Thank you, Dick. Very good presentation, Dick. Thank you, from Martin Richard Coulter. And yeah, Caroline Knox, thank you very much. Great, thanks so much from Charles Bradfield. Thank you to everyone on your worm inputs. So just a flavour of the votes of thanks to you, Dick, and really great evening. A lot of information to take in there, and thank you very much indeed on behalf of the Institute. Really interesting and yeah, very valuable evening. So
yeah, no problem. Absolute pleasure, and thank you for asking me.
Okay, well, I'm just going to stop the recording now. So if anybody wants to say anything after that, you're very welcome to do so.